Hey guys, welcome back to the Engineered Angler. Today we're going to make a lure that I'm hoping will end up looking like an eel. It's going to be a hard bait, and it's going to be a floating, swimming, segmented eel. I've never made a lure like this, but let me show you what I'm talking about. So this lure will have 3 segments, so 2 cuts, 2 places for joints. The main body will taper down almost to a point, and then I'll have this typical sort of continuous fin all the way around the tail. And that will be pretty small because I don't want to kill the action on this thing with too much fin. It'll have a hook hanger right here at the point where the lure is the deepest, and another one right here just behind that last cut in the lure. The tie-and-eye is very likely to be right at the point of the nose, just because the lure is more or less symmetric from top to bottom. The length of the main body of the lure, not including the fin, will be 7 inches. The highest point of the lure is going to be 1¼ inches. And that highest point is going to occur about 1.5 inches back. And that's also going to coincide with the thickest part of the lure as you look down at it. The first joint will be halfway down the lure. And for the last joint, I'm just going to cut the remainder of the lure in half. And that should occur about 1.75 inches away from the first cut. So I'll be making the lure out of a piece of cedar. This is actually a true 1 inch by a true 3.5 inch. I had to replace a window last year and I figured I'd keep the trim piece. It is really aromatic cedar and it's light. And cedar is an excellent wood for floating lures. And that's how I'm going to make the lure. It's going to be unique in that way because I've never made a floating swimming lure. I know a lot of people make them. I don't make them because I just have never used them. Maybe we'll change that. First thing I'm going to do is cut this in half and cut a small piece off so I can calculate the density of the wood. All right, now we have enough to make 2. Let's get started on at least 1. After putting some blue painter's tape on the block of wood, I like to box out my dimensions. First, the length. Then I like to mark the center line. And then I'd like to put a mark where the wide spot is going to be. Using a draftsman's curve, I'll fair in the shape of the head and then all the way back. And I like to make it a little concave along the belly to make it look just a little more natural. And I'll sketch in some head details just for reference. And I'll also put in the outline of where that fin is going to be. I'm not real happy with this little bit of a sketch of the continuous fin. I want to make that kind of go up a little higher on the top and be a little more concave on the bottom. So we'll deal with the fin later, but we'll get started cutting out the main body. So the next thing I want to do is cut the slot for the fin, so I'm going to need a center line. And what I did is I just took half the thickness and set it on my caliper, and I'll just scribe it in with a point. And then mark it with a marker afterwards. Now I'm going to buzz it in maybe 1/8 inch deep with this little Dremel tool. I'll have to widen that slot just a little bit to fit the tongue depressors I'm going to use to make the fins. Now I've got to figure out what kind of taper I'm going to have front to back. I think I'm going to have it a little wider on top, a little narrower on the bottom, and nicely rounded on the sides. And I'm putting a mark here where I want the widest point to occur, and a little tick mark in the middle. And I'm just going to sketch this in. And I'll be sure to stay well away from the lines as I grind down and shape it. Alright, so there's my guidelines to taper it out, and I'll get started on that on the belt sander out there. Alright, so at this point, really got to keep an eye on symmetry because it's real easy to get out of symmetry on a lure like this. I've got the head pretty symmetric from the middle up. From the middle down, it's definitely not symmetric. I'm going to have to work on that. And the body from about halfway back is going to be pretty much round, or pretty close to round. So I've got a lot of grinding to do, and I'll get back to you when I'm really close, and we'll start doing the finishing sanding and thinking about cutting this thing into sections. All right, well, I was getting really close and then I allowed the lure to slip out of my hand and it crashed into something and left a big old dent in it. So I went ahead and got some Bondo body glaze and coated over the damage. So we're gonna wait for this to dry really thoroughly and then sand it back. Hopefully we'll get a nice smooth finish. All right, I've got the sanding pretty much done and I've got most of the damage covered up. I've got the slot cut in on both sides. So right about now, I really got to think about what the process is going to be. Am I going to cut it before I put the fins in? Do I cut it after I put the fins in? Do I think about weight and balance before I put the fins in and cut it? The process can really affect your outcome and how difficult it is to get the lure finished nicely and properly weighted. So right now, I just want to think about figuring the density of this wood so I can be sure that I can get the weight and balance on this. And so I've worked out some numbers here. Let me show you. So I cut a little tiny block from the original piece of wood. And what I've done is I've taken multiple measurements for each of the dimensions. So for instance, the length on A, I took one measurement on one end and another measurement on the other end. I took those numbers and averaged them. And I did that for each of the dimensions. So for the dimension for B, which is this height, I took a measurement at the end, in the middle, and at the other end, and I averaged those. And I did the same thing for the thickness at C. I averaged all those and got the values for A, B, and C, and then I multiplied A, B, and C to get the volume of this little block. And I'm doing this in metric because it's a lot easier, and I ended up with 6.89 cubic centimeters. And then I weighed the block and got 2.73. So now I know the volume and the weight of this block. The density is simply the weight divided by the volume, which is 0.396 grams per cubic centimeter. So that's going to be my main tool to figure out how much weight to put in this. And I do this kind of thing with every kind of wood that I use. But on a lure like this, I'm a little concerned that the lure will end up either head down or tail down. And I really need it to sit really level on the water because I want it to have as much of the body in the water as possible and still float. What I think I'll do is I'm going to go ahead and install the fin and then we'll do the weight and balance calculation. Right. To make the fins, I'm going to use these tongue depressor things and I'm going to go through them a little bit because a lot of them have a little bit of a warp or a cup in them. And I think you could probably see that, how there's a little bit of a cup in it. Here's one that has a nice straight ridge on it and it's nice and flat all the way across. So I'm going to need to that's looking pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and do the bottom one and then we'll glue it all in with some crazy glue and we should be ready to cut this thing in half. I've got both of the fins set in there and I really like the profile it's giving it. It really does look like either an eel or a fish with a continuous fin. And while I still have to do some fairing in and some sanding to get these curves to sort of line up, I want to change the shape of the very back from this perfectly round shape to a little bit of a pointed to the top. Let's glue these in place and then I'll finish sanding and fairing the shape in. Alright, I've got the eye sockets drilled in there and I've sketched in some head details to do a little bit of carving. I don't want to get carried away with the carving. I'm kind of liking the look. Hopefully we can maintain the look of it even after it's cut. Cedar isn't the nicest stuff to carve because it's so soft. It tends to sort of fall apart under your knife. But we'll do what we can with the knife and then we'll come back with some sandpaper and clean it up. Alright, it's coming along, but I have to say this stuff does not like to be carved. Alright, I'm pretty happy with the way this carving is looking. It's not perfect and it still needs a lot of sanding, but I'm going to live with that. Next thing I want to do is establish the cut point. Now, I was intending to cut way back at the middle of the lure for my first cut, but I don't want to leave these two back pieces too small because then I can't really get my hardware and my weight in it. So I moved this first cut line to 2.5 inches from the nose, and then I'm going to go 2 inches back for the second cut. And now comes the scary task of actually cutting through this. So I'm going to cut straight through, try to keep it as perpendicular as possible. One more cut. All right, it's time to shape the joints a little bit. And I've got to now refine the kind of joint I'm actually going to make. Because since it's not a V joint, I want it to be kind of a knuckle joint. That means I'm going to hollow out the front surface of the joint and then round off the back of the joint to fit in there just slightly. And I'll start the process of getting this groove in here with this little drum sander. Now that I've got it started, I'll use a larger drum sander on my drill press. All right, I think that's pretty good right there. Let me do the other one. Now I just need to round these corners off into sort of a rounded end. There you go, something like that. I need to do a little more, and I need to do that final end too. All right, so the joints all mesh pretty well now, and I made sure that the fins align. But now is when we need to really work out the weight and balance. I need to figure out how much weight is going to get each one of these sections to just float. First thing to do is weigh them. All right, the head section weighs 11.54 grams. Midsection is 7.93, and the tail is 4.44. All right, so now if I take the weights of each section and divide it by the density of the wood, which was 0.396, I get the volume of each section. So I've got 29.14, 20.03, and 11.21. Those are the volumes of each section. All right, so what that means is that the weight of any one of these sections has to equal its volume. Since water weighs 1 gram per cubic centimeter, so the buoyant force is equal to the volume of the lure itself. So that means that for the head, the buoyant force is going to be 29.14 grams. So it needs to weigh just under 29.14 grams, but I need to have all the hardware along with it. So let's gather up the hardware. So first I need to make the hook eyes. So I'm going to use this 174 pound strength stainless steel leader wire. And after shaping it into a little bit of a loop, I'm going to go ahead and use these wire twisting pliers to form the eyes. I'll trim it off, leaving about 1.25 inches long, and I'll do the other two. All right, there they are. Let's go ahead and weigh them up. All the hardware included with this head will be 2 of these twist eyes that I made, a hook and a split ring, and the 2 pre-made twist eyes that will be part of the hinge. So we're at 15.56 grams. So since I want it not to sink, so I'm going to give myself a 10% factor of safety. We know the maximum weight that it can be is 29.14 grams, so I'm going to go 90% of that, and that it gives us 26.23 grams. And the difference between 15.56 and 26.23, which is our target, is 10.67 grams. That is the amount of lead I have to add to the body. Let's find some lead shot. I've got some round split shot. Let's see if we can get close. All right, we'll try this smaller one, and that gets us to 26.44. I think that's close enough. Let's go with that. And then on the following 2 pieces, I do the exact same thing. I put together all the hardware and then find lead to make up the difference. Just got to fill these. All right, we got that one in there. Just got to fill that one in. All right, I spared you guys a lot of sanding and filling and sanding, but I also did a few things. Let me show you where I'm at. First, I sanded down all the fill. Everything's pretty smooth. And I also went ahead and cut the slots for the hinges. And you can see I cut a little gap in the fin so I could drill the hole for the hinge pin. That just drops right down in there to capture the hinge eyes. I still got to sand down all the little hard edges because you can't really have those sharp 90-degree edges on there. It's getting kind of late, so I'm going to call it quits, but I'm going to dip these pieces in some polyacrylic, let them soak up plenty of it so it seals the wood, and then I'll let it dry overnight and we'll get back to it tomorrow. Well, you know what? This has really become a pretty involved build, and if we're going to have time to get out on the water, get some really good underwater shots, and get some fishing in, I'm going to have to cut this video right here. So look for part 2 next week where we go ahead and put a nice paint job on it, get it nicely clear coated, and get it out on the water. Hopefully we'll take a special trip out to the reservoir and see if we can't catch a fish. So let me know if you guys like the techniques I'm using, or if you have better techniques or have a better idea for making those long fins or even making the joints. Share that in the comments, and if you have questions, certainly ask questions. I read all the comments and I try to reply to everybody. It's really part of the fun for me. All right, so if you're enjoying the build, give me a thumbs up, and I'll see you guys next Friday. And if you like these segmented swim bait builds, you should check out the one that appears on the screen right now.